The next section that we're going to be covering is water balance, the balancing of the pool water. When we talk about the chemistry of water and water balance, water is a universal solvent. Water can be balanced, which is what we're wanting to have in our swimming pools in the state of Nebraska. Water can also be corrosive. It can also be very scale forming, depending on the environment that the water happens to be in. Water balance, good proper water balance, what's it going to do for us? Optimize how well our sanitizer, our chlorine or our bromine is going to be able to work and kill germs. It's going to extend the life of our pool equipment, provide comfort for our bathers, improve those filter runs, maintain that crystal clear swimming pool water, which we as pool operators all strive for. When we talk about balancing of water, we're really working on, it's a ratio, if you will, between the pH, the water alkalinity, the total alkalinity of the water, how hard the water is, which is something, of course, we've got to deal with in Nebraska, is calcium hardness, and the water temperature. All of these components depend on each other when we discuss balancing of the pool water. The first thing we're going to start with, though, is going to be the pH. What is pH? What does it do for us? It really does, in fact, have the greatest effect on our swimming pool or our spa water. It measures how acidic or how basic the solution of that water is. Now, distilled water has a pH of 7.0. That is considered pure H2O, pure water. Our swimming pools require a pH of around 7.2 to 7.8 are the numbers we're going to strive for, so slightly basic pool water. Now, the pH of human skin ranges between 4.5 to 6.0. And then the pH of our eye, actually, this is the reason why some of our test kits have a pH of around 7.4 to 7.6 listed on the slide comparator of our test kit. The pH of that test kit is going to indicate that, but that's a little bit tighter than what the range is required for our swimming pools. And the reason for that is the pH of your eye is actually 7.5. So what affects the pH? What is going to have an impact of the pH in our swimming pool water? The types of chemicals that are used on a daily basis at our swimming pools are going to have an impact on the pH of that water. The swimmers, I already mentioned the pH of your skin is between 4.5 and 6.0. So the amount of swimmers, the swimmers using your swimming pool are going to influence the pH of the pool water. The weather, the environment that your swimming pool is exposed to. The weather, if, for example, you've heard of acid rain. Sometimes the rainwater, if you ever tested rainwater, the pH can be down around 3, sometimes 4 or 5 for a pH. Have a dramatic impact on a big, heavy rainstorm day. All of that water dumping into your swimming pool can influence the pH of your pool water. The water coming out of your kitchen tap, your source water that you use to fill the swimming pool, can have a different pH outside of the range of 7.2 to 7.8. In fact, some source water that I'm familiar with has a pH around 8 to 8.5. So the water coming out of their tap is safe to drink, but it's not safe for the swimming pool. If you did nothing to that pool water, it would actually be outside of the legal limit for swimming pools. Another example of pH that can be changed or can have an influence on the pH of the pool water is algae. Algae can change the pH. If it doesn't like the pH of the water that it's in, it will change it so that it's an environment that it likes to be in and it likes to grow in. So all of those are going to be a factor when you talk about the balancing of the pH water. Now, pH, we talked about the chemicals that are used on a daily basis. Here's a list of lots of chemicals that are found commonly in our pool pump room. 4 of those items, the trichlor, the dichlor, calcium hypochlorite, sodium hypochlorite, those are types of chlorine that are added in very large quantities into our swimming pool water. Some examples with that trichlor and dichlor. Trichlor with a pH of 2.9 chlorine, incredibly acidic. Dichlor having a pH of 6.7. If those are the products that you're using in your swimming pool on a daily basis in order to maintain chlorine levels in your swimming pool, you're going to have to do something to counteract that very, very acidic product that you're adding to the pool. So commonly you're going to be using an item called sodium carbonate or soda ash that you're going to be adding to counteract that very acidic environment. If you've got liquid chlorine systems, sodium hypochlorite listed there in the bottom of that list of chemicals. Very, very basic environment. You also will typically have a large acid feed system to counteract that very basic chemical properties of that sodium hypochlorite. Now, the reason why pH has such an influence on our pool water is why the water reacts with the chlorine in relation to the pH of the pool water. Now, bromine kind of is very similar to this in nature too, but what happens is you're going to form one of two or a combination of one of these two products. As you dump that chemical into the pool water, it's either going to form into the hypochlorous acid form of chlorine, which is an incredibly aggressive form of chlorine. The go out and take prisoners, the kill the bugs very, very well, the superhero, if you will, of chlorines, hypochlorous acid. That's the type of chlorine that we want to have in our swimming pool to ensure that the water is safe. On the other side of the spectrum, you can have formed the hypochlorite ion. Now, the hypochlorite ion is an incredibly less effective sanitizer when it comes to killing germs. It just kind of lays around all day, doesn't do a whole lot, drinks Gatorade, plays video games, not very effective at doing anything in relation to killing germs. So the hypochlorous acid is what we want to have. The hypochlorite ion can also form in the pool water. Depending on how much of that hypochlorous acid versus the hypochlorite ion is going to form is all going to be dependent on the pH of the pool water. So if you went in your house and you grabbed a gallon of sodium hypochlorite, bleach, down out of your laundry room, you dumped that gallon of bleach into your bathtub, fill your bathtub full of water, dump that gallon of bleach into the bathtub, and then you checked the concentration of the chlorine level in your bathtub. Let's just say, for example, it's about 5 parts per million. 5 parts per million free available chlorine. It's all dependent on the pH on what kind of chlorine that's going to be formed. If we look at the charts, look at the tables, if you have a pH in that bathtub of 7.2, a 7.2 pH will mean that 66% of that gallon of bleach that you dumped into the swimming pool, into your bathtub, is going to be in the form of hypochlorous acid, the aggressive form of chlorine. Now, with my pool test kit, I determined a number I threw out of the air, just 5 parts per million, all right, at 7.2. As the pH goes higher, our chlorine is still there. At a pH of 7.8, my test kit is still going to identify that I've got 5 parts per million available chlorine to kill germs. But that test kit doesn't identify the type of chlorine that is in that bathtub, in that experiment that I'm doing. At the pH of 7.8, though, 2/3 of my gallon of bleach is going to be converted into the lazy cousin, the hypochlorous or the hypochlorite ion form of chlorine. Only 1/3 of that gallon of bleach is actually going to be able to kill germs. My test kit says 5, which is a great number, whether it's at 7.2 or 7.8 or even higher at 8.0. But what my test kit can't tell me is, in fact, it's converted into that hypochlorite ion, and I'm essentially getting no germ kill whatsoever. So into that example, when I told you that some source water I'm familiar with will have a pH of around 8 or even 8.5. In an environment like that, if we didn't do anything to change the pH of that water coming out of the tap and left it at 8.5, am I getting any germ kill at all in my swimming pool water? No, we need to relabel the facility. It's not a swimming pool anymore, it's a cesspool. Yeah, I'd be more than happy to be the first person to swim in that pool, but everything that I leave behind off of my skin or whatever comes out of my body is going to still be there for the next person after that, and the next person, and the next person, because there's no breaking down of that debris, of those germs, of that stuff that's being entered into the swimming pool water. If you think all the way back to the very first section that we talked about, the healthy swimming section of this presentation, we talked about what CDC needed to have in the water for a pH number in order to ensure you had a good germ kill. They wanted to see a 7.2 to 7.4 for the pH in the event of a fecal accident, formed stool, or a diarrhea in without stabilized chlorine, without cyanuric acid in the water. The reason why they want that lower pH number is because they recognize the fact that the hypochlorous acid form of chlorine is what we will end up with. A majority of it will be in the water at that pH range of 7.2 to 7.4. That's good science. That's the justification for those numbers. Now, if you remember back from that first section, if you had a stabilized form of chlorine, if you had cyanuric acid in your pool, you had to drop down to a 6.5 pH or lower. The reason for that is the stabilizer, that cyanuric acid, slows the chlorine down, kind of pulls it back, keeps it from killing germs as readily. So by dropping it down to a 6.5 or lower pH, you end up with a 95 to 100% of the chlorine in the water is going to be in the hypochlorous acid form of chlorine to go out and kill germs and make sure that that water is safe. Good science right there as evidence. Now, I already talked about some situations where you've got a high pH, high numbers for the pH. Higher pH numbers, scale will form. Water tends to become more cloudy. You're going to get beyond the point of saturation for the pool water, and that's where the cloudiness can come into play. The chlorine, we've already discussed that. You get the hypochlorite ion. The chlorine is ineffective. You have an increased risk for disease in your swimming pools. Now, on the flip side, on a lower pH, down below 7.2, a 7.1 or lower, the water is considered acidic for pool purposes. The chlorine, it's hard to keep it in there, dissipates very quickly. You can have rapid loss of alkalinity. Metal can be corroded, as this picture shows with that little pump impeller and that pump setting there. Lots of stains, lots of debris can cause metal corrosion, etching of the plaster walls, all kinds of issues. So if you've got a situation, you do a water chemistry test. You get a sample result as the one showing in this slide. A very, very acidic environment, below 7.0 possibly. What you need to do to bring that pH up is you will add sodium carbonate, soda ash, to the pool water. Now, how much soda ash are you going to dump in? In your pool test kit, when you do the pH test, you add 5 drops of that red solution, that red pH indicator. Also included in your test kit are a couple of more bottles. Those bottles will say acid demand or base demand. Now, this sample on this slide right now is demanding a base. It's a very acidic environment in that swimming pool. So you need to add a base. It's demanding a base in order for it to get back up to the range it needs to be. You would take the bottle of base demand. You would add drop-wise, 1 drop at a time, to that sample that you've got. And each drop, you'd cap and invert it and see what the color change is. You continually add drops up to the point where that sample inside the vial reads the number that you would like to have the pH in your swimming pool. Your test kit has a manual, has a book that describes various tables and charts in the back of that book. In that book, you'll find a table that would indicate how to raise the pH using soda ash. In that book, it will indicate how many drops of base demand or acid demand were added. In this case, base demand. You look at that chart based off of the volume of the pool, and it would tell you exactly in ounces or pounds, depending on the size of your swimming pool, you need to add in soda ash to get the pH of the pool water up to where it needs to be. It eliminates the guesswork. There's no guessing about what number, how much you'd need to add into the swimming pool. Now, if you've got the other situation, in this particular slide, a very, very basic environment in your swimming pool in that particular test. You're going to add muriatic acid or sodium bisulfate, a dry acid, to bring that number down. Same scenario as the previous one in order to bring the pH up. You have 2 bottles, acid demand and base demand, in your test kit. Your sample in that particular pool that you just pulled and took a sample of indicates that the water is very basic, so therefore it's demanding an acid. You would use the vial out of your test kit that says acid demand. Adding 1 drop at a time of acid demand, that color in that vial will start to change from that deep red purplish color to a lighter color red, down to the range of your test kit to a number that it will finally get to where you want, maybe 7.6 or 7.4. The amount of drops that you added, you will then look it up in your instructions in your pool test kit, in the booklet that come along with that. Find the table or the chart, the graph that corresponds to the type of acid that you're going to use, either muriatic acid or the sodium bisulfate. They have different pH numbers. That's why they have 2 separate tables in your instruction book. The amount that you'd need to add then would be based off of the number of drops of acid demand that you dumped into that sample and the volume of the pool water. In that table, it will tell you exactly the amount of pounds or gallons, depending on if it's liquid or dry, that you'd have to add to the water in order to get that pH up. You take that volume, that amount, broadcast it over the entire area of the pool to get that pH to come up. Remember to always follow the directions on the bottle, on the labels, whenever you add any chemicals. And I always encourage, you're going to be testing the pool water multiple times a day, every single day. You're going to see trends within the system. You're going to see trends within those water tests. Make small adjustments, identify where the water's headed with a particular test, and make corrections accordingly. Don't let it get way out of hand where you've got to add large volumes of chemicals in order to get caught back up within your system. The next component of balanced water that we're going to talk about is total alkalinity. Total alkalinity. It's a measure of how well the water is able to fight changes in pH. It's a measure of how well the water can fight back, how strong the water is. We're wanting to know, does the water have a whole lot of muscle? Is it really powerful? Does it have a lot of muscle to be able to fight back to changes being made to the water? Here's a good example. Let's say you've got a whole bus load of summer camp kids that are going to show up and go swimming at your swimming pool. Now, you know they haven't had showers lately. The pH of their skin is probably well down to around the 4.5 or possibly lower pH range. As that adversity, as those swimmers, that low pH, or even, let's say, an acid rain dumps down into your swimming pool. Here comes all of that low pH rainwater flowing into your swimming pool. All those bathers getting, if your water has enough muscle, if the water can fight back and resist those changes, the water's going to do fine. So if I change that word a little bit, if the water has enough alkalinity, if the water has enough muscle, enough alkalinity, it's not going to change. The pH will stay locked in place It's going to be strong enough in order to fight back. Now, on the flip side, if the water doesn't have a whole lot of alkalinity, if the water isn't strong enough to fight back to those changes trying to be made to the pH, when that acid rain, when that rainfall falls down, or that busload of camp kids show up, the water can't fight back. It's going to be very weak. It's going to be very feeble. And as that adversity happens, the pH won't be locked in. The pH will plummet. Let's look at the situations with a high alkalinity. The pH I mentioned would lock in place. Unfortunately, a very, very high alkalinity number, that pH will lock in usually also at a high pH and prevent that you being able to make changes to that pH if you need to. You also have not only high pH, high alkalinity also contributes to cloudiness of the pool water and scale to possibly form inside your swimming pool. Now, a low alkalinity or low alkalinity numbers, the water, kind of alluded to that, is very unstable. It can't fight back. It can't resist those changes. It can be very corrosive. Reference to a situation with pH bounce. I like to refer to it as the pH roller coaster. Time I was managing a pool, the pH in the pool water was around 7.2. Early in the morning before my junior swim classes were going to start. So I didn't feel comfortable with that number, wanted to bring it up just a little bit. So I went back, mixed up a little bit of soda ash, added 1 drop to get that pH up in my sample, and all I needed was just a little bit of soda ash. So I broadcast that out into the swimming pool, brought the pH of the pool water up to around 7.3 to 7.4. So I started at 7.2, now it's been brought up to around 7.4. Okay. Later on that day, during our lunch break, I tested the pool water again, and it had actually dropped back down to 7.2. I'm like, well, that's really strange. Normally, once I get it set and I add a little bit of soda ash to bring up the pH, then it kind of just locks right in, settles right in, and stays there for several days. But in this case, it dropped back down again. So I had enough time. I mixed up a little bit more soda ash, dumped that into the swimming pool, and got it back up to around a 7.4, even a little bit higher, 7.5 in that case, to make sure that I was be ready for the swimming that afternoon. Later on that evening, after the pool had closed, I tested the pool water periodically through the day, had noticed what seemed to be that the pH continued to drop back down. That night, again, the pH was down around 7.2. Very unusual. The next day, added more soda ash. Next day, water was all the way down to 7.0. I knew something wasn't right. And all of a sudden, it clicked. I realized, I wonder how strong do I have enough muscle in my swimming pool for alkalinity? So I tested the alkalinity number. My alkalinity at that point, I discovered, was about 50. And what you need in order to ensure you've got enough strength in the pool water to ensure the water is safe is you need at least 50. 50. I had 50. You need at least 80 parts per million alkalinity number in order to ensure that that pH is going to be stable in the swimming pool. Now, if you discover, like my situation, where you did not have enough alkalinity in the swimming pool, I had to went to my tables in my instruction book that came with my pool test kit, looked up the table, looked up the chart, and what it told me was I needed to add sodium bicarbonate, baking soda. Baking soda added to the swimming pool will impact the alkalinity, bring the alkalinity up, but not influence the pH. So be sure you use the right product if you feel like you need to bring up the alkalinity. Now, to bring down the total alkalinity, let's say you've got a situation where you have a really, really high alkalinity number. There is no upper limit to the alkalinity in the state of Nebraska rules and regulations. I don't have a number at 150 or 180 or 200 that you cannot exceed by state code. because we as inspectors have actually been out and seen water clarity that have been so good you could read the date of a penny on the bottom of the swimming pool in the deep end, and their alkalinity was around 300 or 400. So if your alkalinity is really high and the water clarity is good, the pH number is within the range of 7.2 to 7.8, don't mess with it. Don't change it. Don't mess around with it at all. Leave it alone as far as the alkalinity goes. But if the water clarity starts to get bad, it starts to get a little bit cloudy, and you've got a high alkalinity number, you've got a high pH, you need to scale that back. Bring it down. The way we lower alkalinity, the way we bring it down is the same way we brought down the pH. The same product is used, but it's how it's incorporated into the swimming pool that's going to make the difference. We're going to use muriatic acid or sodium bisulfate, the same thing that we used to bring down the pH. But in this situation, we are going to add all the amount that needs to be added to the deepest part of the pool all at the same time in one location. We're going to slug the pool water with a large amount of acid in that one spot. By doing that, we're creating a very, very acidic environment in that location. It will suck the alkalinity, suck the life out of the pool water, lowering that alkalinity number and not influence the pH a whole lot. Now, when you slug the pool water in the deepest part of that swimming pool, shut the main drain off. We don't want to suck that acid directly down the drain and then have it dissipate throughout the whole pool right away. Dump it in, shutting the main drain off, leave it setting in the bottom of the pool for about 30 to 45 minutes. After that 30 to 45 minute time frame, you need to go ahead and dissipate that high concentration in the bottom of the pool. Don't dump that acid in the swimming pool and then go home for the rest of the day and come back the next day. If you're lucky, you might still have paint on the bottom of the pool. If you've got a liner, it will probably have eaten a hole through it. That's an incredibly acidic environment. After it's sat for about 30 to 45 minutes, go get your broom, go get your skimmer dip net, slur that water all over the place, mix it up, dissipate it, and then go ahead and turn on the main drain. Let that water then circulate throughout the system again. That should bring down that alkalinity, also bring down that pH a little bit, and bring the clarity back. By maintaining a lower pH, bringing that alkalinity down, the clarity should come back. The water will move back from being saturated to a more balanced state by forcing that pH and that alkalinity down. Now, when we talk about water balance, we've also got to have that discussion in relation to water temperature. How do chemicals dissolve, or how are chemicals affected by temperature? Now, we've all done the experiment when we were kids where we took a glass of iced tea and a glass of hot tea, and we took a half cup of sugar and dumped them into each of them at the same time and then stirred both containers. Now, the glass with the iced tea would not dissolve the sugar, dissolve that chemical very quickly. However, the hot tea, the hot water, would dissolve that sugar, that chemical very quickly. So you can see how temperature can influence how chemicals are going to dissolve. Most chemicals, as that example gave with the sugar and the tea, will dissolve more quickly and dissolve more readily as the temperature of the pool water goes up. However, there's a product, there's a chemical that we have in Nebraska swimming pools that does the exact opposite. It's called hardness. Calcium carbonate reacts the opposite way. As the temperature of the pool water goes up, the calcium carbonate molecules, the best way to describe it, they kind of get sticky. And those calcium molecules start to stick together and form bigger and bigger and bigger calcium chains. As those molecules get bigger, they get actually to the point where they will saturate out in the pool water to the point where we can see them in the pool water. actually see the calcium carbonate chains. Unfortunately, they appear to us as cloudiness in the swimming pool water. The temperature that's required in swimming pools is not defined by state code. The water temperature in the swimming pool needs to be at least 32 degrees. It's a law of physics, because anything below 32, you're actually not swimming. It's probably going to be called ice skating. So there's nothing basically in our state code that says this is what you need to maintain your swimming pool on a day-to-day basis. Some general numbers, ideal range for swimming pools, for competition swimming, about 80 is the generally recommended number. From 78 to 82 is what's typically seen as a recreational type of swimming environment at swimming pools. We do have a maximum number that's allowed in our code. It says no swimming pools shall exceed 104. Now, obviously, that is going to directly apply to the temperature in a spa. So is there a reason for you to have a thermometer and keep a thermometer in your swimming pool? There's an increased risk for it to get broken. They tend to grow legs and walk off. They disappear. Yes, we definitely need them in a spa because that maximum number of 104 is defined in the state code. Whenever you make changes, whenever you make adjustments within the swimming pool, you want to know what is the change that needs to be made. What is the problem that has occurred and how much of a change needs to be made because of that problem? How screwed up did you let it get? Then be sure that you use the proper chemical to make that change. We've got 3 different chemicals that we've just talked about that began with the same word of sodium. Sodium bisulfate, sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate. Read the labels and be sure you're using the right chemical to complete the project or complete the change that you want to make. And then the volume of the pool. How big is the pool water? Based off of that, you're going to know how much product you're going to need to dump in order to make that change that you want to make. Now, whenever I would start up my swimming pool at the beginning of the year, the very first thing I wanted to know is how strong is my pool water? How much alkalinity do I have in my pool? And if that alkalinity number is not at that minimum of 80, that is the first change that I needed to make. I wanted to get that water up to an 80 number. Total alkalinity at a minimum of 80. Then I finally got concerned about the pH. Now, if you're like some source water and your pH is very high, around 8 or 8.5, needed to make adjustments, drop that pH down. I wanted a good aggressive form of disinfectant, so I would lower my pH down to that 7.2 to 7.4 range when I would first add my disinfectant, my chemical, my sanitizer to the pool water. And then once I was down around that 7.2 to 7.4 number is when I would finally go ahead and incorporate my chlorine into my swimming pool. Remember, if you've got to add large quantities of chemicals in order to make that adjustment, if it's possible, do so over several days, possibly with smaller doses. You usually get more of an effective change over those gradual time frames. You're testing the water multiple times a day prior to opening. Every 4 hours after that, you're testing. You're required to document that. You should see trends. You should see what direction the water chemistry is headed. Make those adjustments. Minor, small tweaks and adjustments. Don't let it get out of hand. And always remember, never add chemicals to that swimming pool when it is occupied. Always follow the manufacturer's guidelines whenever you incorporate those chemicals on how long the pool needs to be vacated, how long patrons need to stay out of the water before that chemical is properly dissolved. The next section that we're going to be covering is dealing with water treatment. When we talk about water treatment, we want to make sure that that water is safe for our patrons in the swimming pool. Sanitizing versus oxidizing. When we sanitize, we know what that means. We're destroying those pathogenic organisms, those things that are harmful to human health, the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoans, those parasites, versus oxidizing. What does oxidizing mean? We're chemically removing the organic debris, the perspiration, the saliva, the urine, the body oils, the waste, those particulate matters. We're taking that out of the water. We're basically filtering the water on a molecular scale. Let's look at what the oxidation process is a little bit deeper. When we're oxidizing, we're treating, we're cleaning that swimming pool water on a chemical level, on a molecular scale. We're converting that sweat, that debris in the pool water, the urine, those other organics into a gas. Now, what does gas do in water? Gas in water just leaves. Going to dissipate. So that's how it's gotten rid of. It's converting that into a gas. It's able to just leave that pool water. Now, oxidizing, there's chlorine is an excellent oxidizer, and lots of non-chlorine products are also available to us that can oxidize that nasty stuff out of the pool. When we talk about using those terms, shocking, oxidation or the oxidation process, superchlorination, and in fact CDC even likes that word hyperchlorination now within their documents. All of these terms really in essence can be interchangeable. They essentially mean or do basically the same thing. Now when we talk about oxidizers, we've got a lot of sanitizers that are available to us that do an excellent job of oxidation. Our primary sanitizers, now I say and use the word primary because these chlorine and bromine sanitizers leave us a residual. There's something that our test kit can actually measure, actually identify in the water and make sure that the water is safe. Chlorine, bromine comes in multiple different forms. So it's a residual that's left over to verify that that water is going to be safe. Now there's other oxidizers also available to us to be able to oxidize and clean that pool water, but we have to call them secondary oxidizers. Ozone is an excellent example of that, ozone gas. Ozone generation is incredibly powerful oxidizer. So powerful, and that's the selling point of these secondary oxidizers, is that it's so strong, so powerful, that it's going to be able to remove all of the germs, all of the nasty stuff in the water, and your chlorine or your bromine does not get used up. So on an economic standpoint, you're actually going to save money because you're not going to be using more and more chlorine or bromine through the course of the summer. Your ozone, that ozone gas, is going to be able to measure it. We've got to call these oxidizers secondary though. Another excellent example of that is ultraviolet light, UV. Incredibly powerful oxidizer. And same as ozone, unfortunately, we cannot measure it. It's not something that we can scoop up a bucket of water and look at it and go, wow, your ultraviolet light numbers are great today. It's not any quantitative number we can identify versus our chlorine or our bromine numbers where we've actually got a reading that we can read. The reason why they're secondary is that if one of those systems would fail, we would have no way of knowing that. Here's an example of a couple of UV systems. Each one of these light bulbs produces an incredible amount of energy, incredible amount of ultraviolet light generated from this. If those bulbs would happen to get corroded or something would fail within the system, without having a measurable residual, you would have no way of knowing that. So they're great as a backup system where that chlorine, if something would fail, is there, our reserve army, if you will, ready to take over if in case there is a problem within the system. Stabilized chlorine, another type of chlorine. Now, we've already talked about stabilizer and stabilized chlorine all the way back in the very first section, in the healthy swimming section, that if you're using a stabilized form of chlorine or have added stabilizer to the pool, then you need to take different steps in the event of a diarrhea accident in a swimming pool. Well, what is stabilizer? Stabilizer is cyanuric acid. It protects the chlorine molecule from sunlight. Chlorine molecule is incredibly tiny. It's a very, very small molecule. And all it takes is just a little bit of energy from the sun to shine down on the swimming pool and get that chlorine molecule all excited, starts to vibrate, gets all excited, and eventually what happens is that chlorine molecule will just dissipate. Turns into a gas when two chlorine molecules combine together, connect together, which is Cl2, which is chlorine gas, will just leave the water. Cyanuric acid, its function is making that chlorine molecule a little bit bigger. It lightly bonds itself, the best way to describe it, to that chlorine molecule, making it a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier. So when the sun exposes itself, when the sun energy hits the swimming pool, that chlorine molecule is going to stay in our pool. We're not just going to lose it to that sunlight in the pool. We like to see and maintain, if you're going to use a stabilizer or stabilized form of chlorine, 25 to 40 parts per million are some general common numbers that are thrown out there that are good numbers to maintain in a pool. In fact, I've even seen some studies that were done where stabilizer numbers all the way down into the 5 and lower parts per million numbers still had that benefit of protecting the chlorine from the sunlight. The problem is with some types of our chlorine, the trichlor, for example, it has stabilizer incorporated directly in with those chlorine tablets that you put in your chlorinator. And as they dissolve, you're continually adding more and more stabilizer, cyanuric acid, to your pool. The only way to reduce, as your cyanuric acid builds up, the amount of cyanuric acid in the pool is through dilution. The solution to pollution is dilution. So we've got to just drain down that swimming pool water and add fresh, non-stabilized, unchlorinated water to the pool to dilute down that stabilizer number. The local health department in Lincoln actually recommends to never exceed 30 parts per million of stabilizer. Now, if you've decided that, based off of the information that we talked about in the healthy swimming, that if you get a diarrhea accident, you don't want to have stabilizer in the pool, to have to go to those type of extremes, and you're going to switch from your stabilized form of chlorine to an unstabilized form of chlorine. Do not just go ahead and switch your chlorinator over from a stabilized form to an unstabilized form of chlorine. That is a change in type of chlorination systems, change in type of chlorine. Plans and specs would need to be submitted to make sure that chlorinator would be appropriate for that. And in a lot of cases, it is not, because the types of chlorine, stabilized versus unstabilized, when mixed together, can form a very highly exothermic reaction. A lot of energy, a lot of heat is produced, a lot of pressure can be reduced or produced in an environment where you mix those two chemicals together. Very, very dangerous situation. The disadvantage of that stabilizer, like I mentioned, it's going to slow the chlorine down. Stabilized chlorine. And in fact, what the studies that CDC have given to us, the studies that I've talked to the CDC about, is once we see numbers getting up above 50 parts per million stabilizer in our swimming pool, it binds up the chlorine so much that the chlorine becomes less efficient. It loses its efficiency. And in fact, what we found is above 80 parts per million, some of the studies have proven that the chlorine gets locked down so much that you could have a great chlorine level in your swimming pool up around 5 or 7 or 8 parts per million. A fantastic pH number around 7.2 or 7.4. Lots of hypochlorous acid in the pool, ready to go kill germs. But with an excessive amount of cyanuric acid, like CDC has mentioned, above 80, it locks the chlorine down so much that it's unable to kill germs. You need to relabel your facility. It's no longer a swimming pool. It'd be considered a cesspool because there's no germ kill at all in the facility. Remember the state law in our state code that was passed. It cannot exceed 50 parts per million of stabilizer, cyanuric acid, in your pool. Now, the use of stabilizer, stabilized forms of chlorine, on an indoor pool, what does it do? It protects the chlorine from sunlight. So the use of stabilizer in an indoor pool, especially in a new indoor pool, if we receive plans and specs on a new indoor pool, it is not allowed. Those plans as they come in, if we see a stabilized form of chlorine, they will be denied. All right? On an existing indoor swimming pool, if you decide to switch from stabilizer to unstabilizer, you need to submit plans and specs. But if you've got a stabilized form of chlorine in your pool already, and you're able to maintain the water quality to meet within all of the state standards for chlorine, for stabilizer numbers and everything, we would not be in a position to force you to switch your type of chlorination system. However, when it finally gets to the point that that existing chlorination system needs to be replaced at that time, submit plans and specs, get that system approved, and replace that from a stabilized form of chlorine to an unstabilized form of chlorine. No reason to have stabilizer on an indoor swimming pool where the sun is going to expose that chlorine and cause any problems in the first place. Multiple types of chlorination systems are available to us. We've got automated systems for fast dissolving sanitizers like dichlor. We've got liquid feed systems, sodium hypochlorite, liquid chlorine. On this slide, or this particular bullet item, it mentions not very stable. Doesn't mean that it's going to corrode away or it's going to blow up or something like that. What happens over time with liquid chlorine is it will lose its strength. When it first arrives off the shipment, off the truck, that's when the strongest that product is going to be. If you have any liquid chlorine, sodium hypochlorite, available to you after last season's pool, pooled for the start of the next year, the concentration of chlorine in that tank is going to be very, very low. You'll have a hard time even seeing any numbers of chlorine with that leftover liquid in the tank. Be sure to order in a fresh batch, get some new stuff at the beginning of the season in order to ensure you're going to have good chlorine levels to be able to sustain in your swimming pool. Other types of systems are the erosion feeders. The trichlor is the best example of chlorine, slow dissolving. The 1-inch or 3-inch diameter trichlor pucks is the best way to describe those types of systems. Now, chlorine, of course, is the most common sanitizer available to us for disinfections. Probably over 90% of the swimming pools in Nebraska use chlorine as their primary sanitizer. Hypochlorous acid is the product that we get out of that. That's what is going to go kill those germs for us. It's very effective at getting rid of those organisms. Very strong oxidizer. Gets rid of that perspiration, the saliva. That never happened in Nebraska swimming pools, but that urine that's in the swimming pool. Converts that into the gas and gets it to leave the swimming pool. Now the problem is that chemical reaction where chlorine is disabling that organic stuff and converting it into that gas to leave. In the process of that chemical reaction, it will stop in the middle and form those chlorolamines, the bad forms of chlorine. That's what produces and where we get the chlorine smells, the chlorine odors. Free available chlorine, pure chlorine, has no odors and no smells, but once it combines with these other products, that's when you get the smell, the burning eye sensation within a swimming pool. So let's look at how those chlorolamines are formed. When chlorine reacts with that nasty stuff, the organic waste, the body waste, particulate material, perspiration, the oils, the nitrates that get entered into the swimming pool from the environment. That's what we refer to as the combined chlorine. Combined chlorine. That's the chlorine we don't want to have. We have a maximum number in Nebraska by our state code of combined chlorine that is allowed. Your test kit needs to be able to monitor, needs to be able to check for that combined chlorine number. It is a test that is required to be done at least on a weekly basis and documented that it was done and what that number is on a weekly basis. The state law for combined chlorine, we allow up to, but not to exceed 0.5 parts per million. 0.5 parts per million would be okay. Anything above that exceeds the state's minimums for that, and the pool needs to be closed. That is the state law. So what do we need to do to minimize the amount of combined chlorine that's going to be in our swimming pool in the first place? Be proactive. Be proactive by preventing the stuff that causes combined chlorine to form is the first thing. All the way back to that very first slide in the healthy swimming section. Require those patrons to use soap, take a shower prior to entering your facility. Reduce that demand being placed on your disinfectant. You're going to have a much more effective environment where that chlorine is going to be able to do its job. Another example is going to be maintaining by reducing the combined chlorine or not letting it form in the first place. If you maintain a high free available chlorine level in the first place, the combined chlorine is not allowed to accumulate. What happens there? On this side of the chemical reaction, you've got a large amount of free available chlorine. If you've got a lot of free available chlorine, that chemical reaction is not going to stop in the middle. If you've got a very low amount of free available chlorine, if the nasty stuff gets into the swimming pool and starts to build up, that minimal amount of free available chlorine will break down and try to decompose that organic matter. And that's where the chemical reaction stops. It does not go on to the next step. And that next step would be where if there's enough free available chlorine, it's able to convert it into a gas and it will just dissipate out of the water. So by maintaining a high free chlorine residual, now I'm talking around maybe 7 or 8 parts per million, we allow up to 10 for a free chlorine level in our swimming pool. So if you've got a large army, if you will, a large force of chlorine ready to go to war for you, as that nasty stuff gets entered into the swimming pool, it's going to be ready to go to war. There's going to be enough of it that that chemical reaction will not stop in the middle. It will go all the way to completion and continually gas off. You will not get that combined chlorine to build up over the course of time. Now, if in fact you do end up with some extra combined chlorine in the swimming pool, if you have a situation where I was managing a pool one time and my city guy comes down and says, hey, we used a lot of chlorine last year. We've got to minimize, our budget, all those kind of things. So he wanted me to maintain a low chlorine residual. The year before, I was up around 7 or 8 parts per million free chlorine. This year, he says, I want you to keep it around 2.5 or 3 parts per million. I already knew what was going to happen. We actually used more chlorine over the course of that summer because I had to maintain the pool, not let that combined chlorine, once it got to 0.5, I had to take means to get rid of it. There was a study done, and that's exactly what happened. They took 2 identical swimming pools. Those 2 swimming pools with the exact same chlorination system, the exact same type of chlorine, filtration system, everything was the same. At those 2 pools, they loaded each of them with the same amount of debris into the swimming pool. This pool on this side of the equation, or on this side of the study, maintained a low free available chlorine. The pool on the other side of the study maintained a high free available chlorine. At the initial start, yes, this pool at a low number, around 2 or 2.5, didn't take very much chlorine to get it up to that minimum that they need to maintain. This one on this side had to increase and add a lot of chlorine, but once they got that number established, The demand being placed on both systems was the same. So the amount of chlorine that was used up in both of them was the same. However, because this pool didn't have enough free chlorine to completely break down the organic matter that was introduced into it, we got combined chlorine to build up over the course of time. So this pool continually had to break point or had to shock the swimming pool and get that bad form of chlorine to gas off, whereas this pool used a fraction of the amount of chlorine as the other pool because they had enough in the chemical reaction to continually gas off. Now, if you would happen to run into a situation where the 0.8 or where you ended up with a combined chlorine number, as an example, as I was alluding to, a 0.8 combined chlorine number, we'll just throw that out for argument's sake. You do a pool chemistry test. You check your free chlorine. You then check the combined chlorine, and you discover that you're above the state limit of 0.5. So under this example, I said 0.8. The way you correct this, option number one, if you're a geeky kind of pool operator science guy like I was, this is kind of a neat thing to do. You go back into the pump room. You make sure you've got plenty of chlorine in your chlorinator, plenty of gas in your cylinder or whatever your method is for getting chlorine into the swimming pool. And you turn that thing on full blast. Then out by the swimming pool, you test the chlorine level. At that pool I was running that one summer, it was probably around 2.5 or 3 parts per million. 10 or 15 minutes later, with the chlorination system turned on full blast, 10 or 15 minutes later, you test it again, and it's probably going to be up around 4 or 5 parts per million. You leave it turned on, full blast. After about 10 or 15 minutes later, it's going to be up around 8 or 9 parts per million. You're building that army. You're amassing that army of free chlorine ready to go to war for you to try to get rid of that nasty combined chlorine that's happened in the chemical reaction. As that builds up, you test it again. It's up around 11 or 12 parts per million. Then your next test, at some point in time, one of the tests you're going to do, it's going to go from that high number just 10 minutes earlier, and it's going to drop. Dramatic drop, down to around 5 or 6 parts per million. What just happened? Where did all of that chlorine that you had in there go? As you build up that army over here, at some point in time, it finally decides, all right, we've got enough. We've tipped the teeter-totter far enough to one side that it's going to go ahead and attack that nasty combined chlorine in that middle of that chemical reaction. Break it down, tear it apart, convert it into a gas, and the free chlorine, along with that nasty stuff that it was breaking down, will leave the pool. Will dissipate out of the swimming pool. That is what's called the break point reaction. You reached the break point of the chemical reaction. You broke the chemical reaction, got rid of that combined chlorine out of the swimming pool, gassed it off to remove it out of the pool. That's how you eliminate that combined chlorine. Now, if you're not a geeky kind of science guy like I am, this is the process that is normally done to eliminate the combined chlorine. Whoop, ahead of myself just a little bit. This is an example, this slide, of the breakpoint chlorination process that we just did. As I increased that free available chlorine, it kept getting larger and larger. At some point, that chlorine, and in this graph, it was around 11 or 12 parts per million, will break that reaction where it will dramatically drop down. And if you left that chlorinator alone, it will just skyrocket right on up. But once it breaks the reaction, you can go ahead and shut that off. You've just burned out that nasty stuff. Now, as I was getting ahead of myself, the second way to eliminate, which is what most people probably do, is they will use the shocking method or the superchlorination method of getting rid of that combined, that bad form of chlorine, option number 2. A general rule of thumb, to reach the break point of that reaction, you take 10 times whatever your combined chlorine level was. The break point's going to equal that. Now, under my example, I used 0.8 combined chlorine. So you'd multiply that number, the break point, 10 times the combined chlorine. So if I had 0.8, 10 times 0.8, I need 8 parts per million more than what my minimum chlorine level is in order to reach that break point in the chemical reaction. Now, if you do not get enough in there, you actually can end up with the other extreme where you might end up with more combined chlorine if that does not gas off in your swimming pool. If you've got an indoor swimming pool, now if you're like most indoor pools that I've been to, you know, they'll tell you how wonderful their air circulation system is. There's no humidity in an indoor swimming pool. There's no moisture on the walls. There's no condensation on the windows at all. Their ventilation system is phenomenal. Well, if your pool's not like that, one of the concerns that people have is when you do the break point, whether it's through the break point process of cranking up your chlorinator and testing it over the course of time, or shock method. As that product, that combined chlorine gases out of your swimming pool, that gas is usually heavier than air. It's going to set right along the surface of that swimming pool water, and it will accumulate right on the surface of the water. If you don't have a good circulation system, air movement system within your facility, that gas that rises up out of the pool water eventually will drop right back down into your water in an indoor pool. Now, most outdoor pools, that's not so much of a concern because they've got some pretty good ventilation systems available to them. But on an indoor pool, what I usually recommend, if you need to do the breakpoint chlorination process, if you need to shock your pool, get a big fan, set it up on one side of the swimming pool, turn that on so there is air blowing over the surface of that water. So as that gases up out of the surface of the pool water, you've got good air movement to get that nasty gas off of the surface of the water up onto the deck. And if the setup is such, you can put fan on one side, open up a door to the outside on the other side to let some fresh air come in and circulate through. That's going to make things even better. Get that air movement over the surface of that water, and you'll get a much more effective shock or breakpoint chlorination process when you follow that procedure on an indoor swimming pool. Water balance. Water treatment, the last two sections that we've talked about. We understand why it's important to have good balanced water. We now understand how to make sure that our sanitizer and what benefits do our sanitizers, bromine, chlorine, and how they oxidize and remove that nasty stuff out of the swimming pool water. Now we need to be able to understand how to test that the residuals in the swimming pool and make sure that we're able to maintain and have a good, safe environment. Why is it that we need to test the swimming pool water? Well, first, of course, it is required by the code, and we want to make sure that we've got that good, balanced water that we strive for. Good, crystal clear. The clarity is great. Control that algae growth. Good water testing practices, water testing procedures on a regular basis are going to save money on chemical use, maintenance of equipment, healthy environment for those swimmers, our patrons in our swimming pools. And of course, one more valuable tool is during complaints, during even potential lawsuits against your facility, good water testing procedures, good water balance, making sure that water clarity is good, can save you under those particular types of situations. Your test kit that you use to test the water needs to be accurate, needs to be reliable. Make sure that you are using the free available /chlorine bromine FAS DPD process. That is the type of process that needs to be used to test those two chemicals, chlorine or bromine, FAS DPD. Not only for the free chlorine and bromine, but you've got to be able to test for combined chlorine, the pH of the pool water. We understand how important that is when we balancing the water, the total alkalinity. If you're using a stabilized form of chlorine or have added stabilizer, cyanuric acid, you've got to be able to test for that too. Make sure it never exceeds that 50 parts per million number. In order to get good water results, good test results, fresh reagents, fresh chemicals in your test kit. If you're an outdoor swimming pool, the reagent in your test kit from last year, they're gone. They are no good. Replace them. store those chemicals, those reagents in a non-chemical storage area. I prefer the bathhouse area, the main office possibly. If that's not reasonable, away from chemicals in the pump room, do not store them on top of the water heater like this individual did, where the pH indicator basically separated and was pretty much worthless. Store in a cool, dark location if possible. The testing for your sanitizer, chlorine or bromine, and the pH. We've already talked about this. Prior to opening, whenever that may be, whether you've got swim lessons or just an open general swim that starts at 1 o'clock, is the water safe? Before opening and then every 4 hours on the sanitizer and the pH needs to be tested when the pool is open. Every week, we want to see the total alkalinity numbers verified. Verify that your combined chlorine is not any higher than 0.5 parts per million and that your stabilizer numbers, your cyanuric acid, is below 50. Check those numbers. Be sure that that information is recorded on your log sheet. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. In a court of law, well, I test it every day, but if you didn't write it, doesn't mean anything. Write those numbers down, showing what those levels are. Procedures. You want to do a sample that represents the entire body of the water. In fact, when I would test our swimming pool, I would go to different parts of the swimming pool periodically at different parts of the day. Didn't matter exactly where I tested. I just want to make sure that the general sample from the rest of the swimming pool was relatively similar. Recommend that you sample from multiple locations, different spots throughout the facility, and be sure that you get down between 12 to 18 inches below the surface of that water in order to ensure that that nasty, dirty surface water of that swimming pool, that you're going to get below it so you can get a good sample that represents the entire body of the water. You want to rinse that comparator really well because from one test to the next, those chemicals that you use can influence the results of your previous test. And measure carefully. Pausing between each drop when you're doing the chlorine test. Don't sit there and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drops to get like 1 part per million. Pause a little bit between each drop, even count 1 1,000, 1 1,000 between each drop and swirling continuously. Hold those reagent tubes straight up and down. The size of the drop can have a huge impact on the results of your test. When you do the samples and you swirl between each drop, do not shake the reagents in the slide comparator because what can happen is it will ruin the results of your test, especially when you're doing the pH test. Shaking those samples can damage that pH reagent. Always think swirl or put the caps on and invert that slide comparator and bring it back up. And never use your fingers to keep the water from flowing out. Always use the caps because the pH of your hand, we talked about that earlier, 4.5 to 6.0 pH, dramatically impact the results of your test potentially. Whenever you do a water test, I always consistently used the same concrete brick wall, was painted white for me to be able to do the test. Every time I did it, for consistency, a light background in order to get a good reading on those results. And on your sample, you want to measure from the bottom of the curve of that water that's in the vial. Be sure that you hold that up and get the bottom, it's called the meniscus line. Not the upper edge that's touching the outside of the vial, but the bottom of that curve is giving us a good, accurate number. You think with a 300,000 gallon swimming pool, that little bit of curve could influence how much chemicals you may have to dump in your swimming pool? Absolutely. Those test results being accurate are very, very important. Now to do a free available chlorine test, you can fill up your slide comparator to either 10 milliliter sample or a 25 milliliter sample. Now in this example on this slide, we've got 25 milliliter sample that we're going to use to do the test. Depending on how much water you get from the swimming pool is going to depend on how much the value for each drop of reagent you're going to get for a final result. you're going to add 2 dippers of the little white DPD powder. As you add those 2 dippers of powder, it will turn a pink color. In the presence of chlorine, that powder, the DPD powder that you're going to use, will turn pink. Now, if you add a couple of dippers of powder and that sample is clear, the amount of chlorine in that sample is probably 0, but be very, very careful about that. Because sometimes, because chlorine acts as a whitening agent, sodium hypochlorite, that's what we use to get our socks all white in the washing machine, to whiten at incredibly high levels, that can actually bleach out that pink color. So if you add a dipper full of powder and right where that powder touches the water and it's very high concentration, if you see a pink color, that means that there is chlorine actually in and you don't have a 0 result. So after you add the 2 dippers, you invert the comparator 3 or 4 times. You might have a little bit of powder still floating around in there, but that's fine. You will then add drops of your titrating reagent until the sample turns clear. Each drop you add, you will want to swirl and pause after each drop and count the total number of drops. Based off of the amount of water that you've got in your sample, if it was a 10 milliliter sample of water, every drop counts as 0.5 parts per million. If it was a 25 milliliter sample, which was used in this example, each drop that you add to your vial to try to turn it pink counts as 0.2 parts per million. So under both situations, if you counted 10 drops, depending on the volume, there's the equation. 10 drops would equal 5 parts per million chlorine in a 10 milliliter sample. 10 drops in a 25 milliliter sample would equal 2 parts per million chlorine. So you can see that a 25 milliliter sample is going to be a much more accurate sample when you've got a low or a high level of chlorine. If you maintain around a 5, 6, or 7 part per million chlorine, you know that 10 milliliter sample of water is probably going to be accurate in a plus or minus 0.5 while you're doing the test. You're going to be fine. But if you maintain or have a very low number, you might want to do the 25 milliliter sample to get a more accurate number. Now, I mentioned already about what can happen if those chlorine levels are incredibly high. It acts as a bleaching agent. You'll add a couple of dippers of powder into the sample. You'll put the lid on, you'll invert it, you'll see a purple or see a pink color indicating chlorine, and then it will go clear. If that's the case, that means you've got an excessive amount of chlorine in the water, so high that your test kit probably can't read it. You can try adding 2 or 3 more dipperfuls of powder into the sample, and that might be enough to cause it to turn to that pink color. Then go ahead and do the titration process. You'll find the numbers to be incredibly high. Be careful with that. People make a huge mistake thinking the sample actually has 0 chlorine, so they turn their chlorinator up even higher, or they add more chlorine to the system because they think there is no chlorine at all. You can really run into some major problems with that by increasing those numbers and getting the system to bleach out your sample results. Now, if you're using bromine, a bromine type of disinfectant in your swimming pool, the procedures are a little bit different with your bromine kit. It's the same steps, the same as chlorine with the powder, but when you multiply the drops out, make sure you use the correct number if it is a bromine kit in your bromine pool. Every drop counts as 1.25 in a 10 milliliter sample. If you're using a 25 milliliter sample, it counts as 1 drop for 0.5 for the bromine levels. An example of this, at a 25 milliliter sample, if you only added 4 drops of your agent times 1.25, you actually have 5 parts per million. 4 drops in a 25 milliliter sample testing your bromine in your bromine pool, 4 drops would mean 2 parts per million bromine. Now, sometimes I will run into situations where people have a bromine type of system, and they actually are using a chlorine test kit. In fact, the state of Nebraska, I don't even have a bromine kit that I use when I go out to do inspections. So if you've got a bromine pool, I'm actually going to be using my chlorine test kit to test the bromine in the pool. Be sure that if you've got a chlorine kit and you're using bromine in your pool, that you do the multiplication factor to convert your results from a chlorine test result to a bromine result. Your final number with your chlorine kit in that pool, you're going to multiply that final result by 2.25 parts per million. Then that will tell you the amount of bromine in your pool. So if you had a 5 part per million test result with your chlorine test kit in your bromine pool, you multiply that by 2.25, you have an 11.25 part per million bromine concentration in that swimming pool. If you had a 2 part per million result with your bromine kit or with your chlorine kit in a bromine pool, you would actually have a 4.5 part per million bromine concentration in your pool. When you do the pH test, one of the most simplest tests that we've got available to us, you fill the vial up to the very, very top, almost to the 44 milliliter line. That's the number you shoot for. Once you get it filled to the 44 milliliter line, you add 5 drops of your reagent, your phenol, your pH indicator. After you add those 5 drops, you cap that, you invert it. Don't shake the sample, never shake any of the samples. You invert it 2 to 3 times, and then you take the reading. You read what that result says. One of the most simplest tests available. Match that color that's in that vial to your color comparator on your slide. One of the problems you can run into with the pH test if you maintain a higher chlorine residual. What I mean by higher is above 5 parts per million. Anything above 5 parts per million, you might run into a situation where your pH result will show a really kind of a weird purplish type of color instead of a gradient from yellow to red. If that's the situation you've got because of a higher chlorine level, it's reacting with the pH indicator, with the calcium in the water, a lot of other factors, the alkalinity, you would need to go ahead and add to the sample prior to adding the phenol red indicator. You would take your bottle of thiosulfate, which is in your test kit, it's got a green cap. You would take that bottle of sodium thiosulfate and add 1 drop of thiosulfate to your sample before you add the phenol red indicator. That will drop the chlorine level down in that sample to a point where it's not going to react with the pH indicator and give you a weird reading. Then go ahead and add your 5 drops of your pH indicator, and you should get a good number, a good reading off of your slide comparator at that time. Your cyanuric acid test uses a lot of product. You fill up your pool water in your dispensing bottle for cyanuric acid with 7 milliliters of pool water. You then dump 7 more milliliters, so a 14 total milliliter sample into your dispensing bottle, and you will, that is the one sample, you actually do mix for 30 seconds. You shake it for 30 seconds. Once that's been shook up, you then would slowly add that into your slide comparator. The smaller of the 2 tubes has a black dot in the bottom of it. Adding it dropwise into there, you keep dumping it in until you can no longer see that black dot. Then, holding the slide comparator up, whatever level is in that sample would tell you what the cyanuric acid levels are in that test sample. For the alkalinity test, you're going to want to get rid of the chlorine in the water first. So you pull up that sample, you get 25 milliliters in the sample, you get the thiosulfate out and add 2 drops of chlorine neutralizer, thiosulfate, to the sample. Swirl that. Then you add the 5 drops of your alkalinity indicator. That's the green solution. The alkalinity, as we talked about, we're testing to see how strong the water is, how it can stand up to resist changes. If your water can resist changes, we're going to be adding an acid to that sample of water. Because it can resist changes so much, we're going to want to be careful and dump in a lot of sulfuric acid if there's a very high alkalinity. Every drop that you add to the sample, it counts as 1, or it counts as 10 parts per million alkalinity. So as you add that to the pool water, each drop counts as 10. So example, if you added 15 drops, you multiply that times 10, you get 150 parts per million alkalinity in the pool water. In your test kit, inside the lid, all of the directions are included. And in fact, if you look at the sample bottles, those sample bottles are all color coordinated. The ones that you use for chlorine have yellow caps, yellow lids. The instructions in the lid of your test kit are all yellow for the chlorine types of tests. The phenol red, the pH tests, all have the bottles labeled with red lids, samples. Those are also indicated in the sample by color coding with the instructions in your test kit. Whenever you take those results, you've got to record them down. Record those test results. Any adjustments that you make to your water chemistry, if you decide you're going to turn up or turn down your chlorinator, write that down. Indicate that on your log sheet. If you have to do any equipment maintenance, identify that, write it down. Daily patron loads. All of this information helps you understand the changes that are occurring within your swimming pool so that you can anticipate the changes before they happen, so you can make adjustments. So for example, on a really, really hot summer day, huge patron load in the swimming pool, lots and lots of swimmers. If your chlorine level is very low, borderline at 2 parts per million, you may want to go ahead and anticipate, get a lot more, crank that chlorinator up there, establish a higher residual to maintain and be sure that it will never drop during the course of that day down below the 2 parts per million level. Be sure also that as the pool operator, you have to have your pool operator card on site and available if anybody has any questions about that swimming pool. The chlorine levels, results for your swimming pool. We've already talked about these numbers. They need to be between 2 and 10 parts per million. Your bromine level for a swimming pool, we allow up to 18, same number, 2 parts per million for the minimum. The pH should be between 7.2 to 7.8. You need to be closing the swimming pool if any of these circumstances do not exist. Combined chlorine, if it's above 0.5, you're closed. Chlorine levels outside of that range, you're closed. Bromine outside of that range, you're closed. pH, same thing. If your stabilizer, the state law says 50. If it's above that, you're closed. If you can't see the main drain, under any of these circumstances, close that swimming pool. We want to have the pool. You as the operator, you as the person maintaining that facility, it's your responsibility to see that it's maintained within the state law requirements and close when it doesn't meet the state law. Make the changes, the adjustments, and at that time, once it's back within the parameters and been tested and verified, you can go ahead and reopen. Information for a spa, chlorine levels, bromine levels, pH, the combined chlorine, same numbers on those. The bromine and chlorine, the minimum is a little bit higher in a spa. The stabilizer, if it's above 50, same scenario as a spa. Again, if you can't see the main drain, any of these 6 items don't meet the standard, you need to close your spa. It's got to be closed. Take the initiative. Don't rely on an inspector. You are the one that's responsible for that facility. The last section that we're going to talk about in our swimming pool operator class today deals with water spas. hot water chemistry. What are some issues associated with spas that we need to be concerned about? The problems with spas: hypothermia, entrapment. We're in direct contact in a lot of cases right there with that main drain, with those skimmers on the side of the spa, those suction points within the facility. So entrapment is a real concern. There's a type of bacteria called Pseudomonas that loves to reside in a spa. Dermatitis is an issue because of the hot water, your pores opening up. And of course, something everybody feels like they got to have down by that spa is that glass bottle. Also a major concern within different types of, within those facilities. Common spa issues are we talking about is swimmer bacteria. Pseudomonas, that bacteria, loves the water temperature of 98 to 105, right in the ballpark of the temperature of a spa in the state of Nebraska. What are some common problems, diseases that are caused by this Pseudomonas bacteria? Eye and ear infections, swimmer's ear, skin and respiratory infections. Think about sitting in that hot tub, that water level is right there and you're breathing in that moisture and that bacteria and all that stuff getting down into your lungs and stuff. Not properly maintained, it can cause some real problems, urinary, gastrointestinal infections, all kinds of things. What is happening within that spa? What is going on? The recirculation of that spa water. The turnover rate in a spa is required to be that volume of that spa once every 30 minutes. Incredibly high turnover rate. We got to get that water moved through there as quick as possible. As that water's pulled out, just like a swimming pool, it needs to be filtered. We need to get those chunks out, the big debris. Sanitized, making sure that if there is any stuff that gets into a spa, which people get in them, their body temperature, it's 103, 104 degrees. You're going to sweat. A lot of organic material is getting introduced. The water's then heated, returned back into the spa. You need a separate blower system set up for the air blower to recirculate that water throughout the facility. A lot of spas that we see actually use a cartridge or sand type of filter. They're fairly small because of the volume of water. They don't need a lot of surface area to get an effective filtration process. If you do use a cartridge type of filter, a paper kind of filter, you've got to have at least 2 cartridges on hand. One that is in operation, that's in the filter, and then a second one. It takes a good 2 to 3 days for these to be cleaned inside a great big huge barrel with a very, very strong detergent to break down those oils and that debris that will form on those cartridge filters. The minimum requirements for water chemistry, we just got done talking about these, but spas seem to be more of a problem than just about any other type of facility due to the small volume of water, the heated water, things change very, very quickly. The minimum free chlorine, we do require a higher minimum than all other facilities, all swimming pools. 3 parts per million. Bromine, 4 parts per million. The pH range is still the same. Alkalinity is also still the same. But temperature range, typically 98. The maximum allowed is 104. What we tend to find is that air mixture into the water, the hot water, causes the pH of a spa to actually tend to drift up. More spas that I test when I'm out doing inspections tend to have a 7.6 or even pushing a 7.8 pH. Now we learned in a chlorine environment, what type of chlorine do we form at a 7.6 to 7.8 range? That hypochlorite ion, the worthless kind of chlorine. So we don't get a very effective germ kill in these very hostile environments. So a lower pH is critical. Watch the pH levels in order to ensure that we've got a good germ kill in the swimming pool. You need to have a timer set up for the hydrotherapy. That pump and that air blower needs to be outside of arm's reach, on the wall, away from the spa. Someone's going to have to actually get up out of the spa to go adjust that timer to turn it back on again in the pool. Yes, I know the Virginia Graham-Baker Act addresses those suction points in the pool, that main drain, those skimmers in the pool. but we still, because we are in direct contact with that main drain, direct contact with that skimmer location, you need to have an emergency shutoff near that spa in the event of an entrapment type of situation that shuts off the entire system. Not just the circulation pump, but everything needs to shut down on that spa in case of an emergency. There's another example of that on an outside system, a little pole with that emergency shutoff button located over by the pool spa regulation signs. A thermometer, because there is a maximum temperature that's allowed for a swimming pool in the state of Nebraska of 104, needs to be provided. Now, that doesn't necessarily say that we are requiring that the thermometer be in the spa all the time. In fact, I recommend not to leave one in there because they tend to disappear. They grow legs and run off. Or worst case scenario, they get broken and you could possibly have glass that would get into your spa. I usually would go out and put the thermometer into the spa while I'm doing the water chemistry test. Then once I got done, read the number, verify that my number of my spa temperature is 104 or less. Write that number down. If it's higher than that, maybe add some fresh water to cool that spa down to get it back within the range. Scale that water heater back just a little bit. A lot of facilities do have those thermometers incorporated into the circulation system back in the pump room or on a digital readout on the actual water heater itself. As long as that's verified to coincide with the temperature in the spa, then that would be adequate also. Depth markings, just like a swimming pool, need to be provided. As someone walks up to that spa, they've got to have an idea how deep the deepest point of that spa is going to be. Signage is a little bit different in our rules and regulations. On Title 178, Chapter 2, page 13 of our rules, it has the very specific spa requirements. And on there, the very bottom line of that spa requirement on this particular sign, it says no one under the age of 5 is permitted to use the spa. Be sure that that is posted somewhere in the area of your spa or in the spa area. This last segment deals specifically with all swimming pools. Ground fault circuit interrupters. There were a group of boys, this was about 8 to 10 years ago, at a swimming pool down in Missouri. Those boys went out to go swimming. It was a Saturday morning at their apartment complex pool. Those 3 boys went out to the side of the swimming pool, and the first boy dove into the swimming pool water. He went to the bottom of the swimming pool lifeless, his body resting in the bottom of the pool. Another one of his friends knew that something wasn't right. They knew that kid could swim really, really well. Their buddy was a great swimmer. So one of his friends out of the 3 then jumps into the swimming pool to go get his buddy. He knew something wasn't right. He needed to help him. Human nature, that's what we do. He jumps in to go help him. The second teenager jumps in. That second boy goes to the bottom of the swimming pool, not moving, lifeless. Luckily, the third boy could not swim very well. He didn't feel comfortable just jumping into that deep of water. So he went down to the far end of the swimming pool, down to the shallow end of the pool, where the steps were located, where the wedding cake kind of steps to step down into the swimming pool. He went to go step into the swimming pool, and as he was getting closer to the swimming pool water, his foot was just a matter of an inch or 2 off of the surface of that water, and an arc of electricity came up out of the surface of the water and shocked that boy's foot. What had happened was the night before, the underwater pool light in the deep end of that swimming pool had fallen out of the socket. The bolts had rusted through, fallen out of the socket, and over the course of the night, it had rested against that pool, that wire rubbing back and forth, rubbed through. That swimming pool was a part of the electrical circuit for that facility. The cause of death for those 2 boys was not drowning. Those 2 boys were identified as electrocuted. Electricity and water do not mix. Every year before our swimming pool would get opened up, we had an electrician that would come out to our facility and they would go through the entire electrical system. They would check to make sure that our ground fault circuit interrupters in our bathhouse, the plugins in the bathhouse were properly grounded and were working. They went through the pump system. They made sure that it was properly grounded and that the breakers in the breaker panel were functioning and working the way they're supposed to. Water and electricity do not mix. Please, please be careful when working around the swimming pool and make sure that all of your electrical system is working adequately. We mentioned the carbon monoxide detectors also earlier. The enclosure in an indoor swimming pool needs to have carbon monoxide detectors. And that is the reason because there were a group of girls at a swimming pool party. Those 12-year-olds, a lot of them started to get sick. They started to feel sick to their stomach, started feeling very nauseous, very lightheaded. Called 911. The fire rescue staff could not even enter the building because the carbon monoxide levels were so high. The flue on the water heater had fallen off. Had a carbon monoxide detector been in that facility, it probably would have prevented a lot of those kids from getting sick that day. Very dangerous. Those water heaters, carbon monoxide detectors are there for not only the patron safety, but back in that pump room, and all pump rooms that have water heaters need to have carbon monoxide detectors.